The studio lights burned hot. The crowd, mostly quiet, shuffled in their seats as cameras rolled and teleprompters flickered into motion. It was a nationally televised political talk show, the kind known more for sound bites than substance. The host, Julian Marks, was a sharp-tongued cable veteran, famous for grilling guests with snark disguised as intellect. And today, his guest was Congressman Byron Donalds. Donalds, conservative firebrand, businessman and rising star, had been invited under the pretense of an open conversation about race, education and economic opportunity in modern America. But anyone who knew Julian Marks's style knew better. From the opening minutes, Marks kept interrupting, laughing off points, and subtly undermining Byron's experience. But the moment that shifted everything came 22 minutes in, during a segment labelled Education and Elitism. Julian leaned back in his chair, grinning like a man who thought he'd already won. "Let's be honest, Congressman," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "You didn't exactly come from an Ivy League pedigree. You're not, say, Barack Obama." The studio gave a nervous chuckle. Byron didn't smile, he didn't blink. He just stared back, calm as stone. "No," Byron said evenly. "I'm not Barack Obama, but maybe that's the point." Julian raised his eyebrows, smug. "So enlighten us, Byron. Tell us about your illustrious academic journey. I think America's curious." The way he said it dripped with condescension. The crowd caught it. Social media caught it. But Julian didn't care, until Byron leaned forward, rested both hands on the desk, and started talking. "You really want to talk credentials, Julian?" The host laughed again, already preparing his rebuttal. "Oh, absolutely." And in that instant, he made the biggest mistake of the interview. Because what Byron Donalds said next wouldn't just flip the script, it would ignite a national conversation. The smirk never left Julian Marks' face. Not yet. He was still enjoying the setup of his own joke, not realizing that Byron Donalds had already begun turning the tables. Byron adjusted his mic, leaned in slightly, and spoke with the clarity of a man who had waited long enough. "I didn't go to Yale, Julian. I didn't wear loafers and sit through philosophy class debating theory with trust fund kids." The crowd shifted, a few chuckles, a few eyebrows raised. "But let me tell you where I did go." He held up a single finger. "I went to Florida State University, first in my family to walk into a college classroom. A second finger. I went to the back office of a financial firm where I started with entry-level work, no connections, no favors, just grind. Third finger. I went into communities where nobody handed out opportunities, and I built businesses anyway. Not in theory, in reality." The room was getting quieter now. Julian's smile twitched. "And then," Byron said, "I went to the House of Representatives. You know, the one where I now sit on the Budget Committee, the Oversight Committee, and the Education and Workforce Committee." He leaned back slightly. "Not bad for a guy who didn't go Ivy League, huh?" The crowd erupted. Applause, laughter, and a few cheers. It was spontaneous, unplanned, the kind of reaction that even studio producers couldn't mute fast enough. Julian tried to cut in. Okay, but we're talking academic prestige, Byron." But Byron didn't stop. "Let's talk prestige, then. How about being a black conservative in a system that assumes your success has to be explained away?" He looked Julian dead in the eye. "You laugh at where I went to school, but I've taught more young men how to escape poverty than any professor ever did with a PowerPoint." More claps. Someone in the back whistled. The cameras kept rolling, and now even the control room was buzzing. Byron continued, "I didn't inherit my platform. I earned it, in the boardroom, in barbershops, in broken neighborhoods where credentials don't matter. Results do." Julian's laughter was gone now, because what was supposed to be a jab at Byron's education had become a masterclass in earned experience. And the crowd? They weren't just watching anymore. They were listening. By now, the atmosphere in the studio had changed entirely. The audience, initially polite and neutral, was visibly leaning in, fully tuned to Byron Donalds, the kind of shift that no teleprompter or studio script could predict. Julian Marks, momentarily off balance, shuffled his notes and tried to steer the conversation back into safer waters. "All right, Byron, so you've had success. I'll give you that," he said with forced coolness. "But isn't it fair to say that education still opens doors for most Americans?" Byron nodded. "Sure, it can. But education isn't the same as indoctrination, and lately too many people confuse degrees with depth." He tapped the desk once, not for drama, but emphasis. You want to know where I got my real education? Now the crowd really leaned in. I got educated watching my mother work double shifts and still come home to cook. I got educated in neighborhoods where failing schools were the norm and nobody came to fix them. I got educated balancing ledgers while feeding a family and trying to start a business in a system that's designed to drain small dreams. He paused, looking directly into the camera now. And I got my PhD in perseverance when I ran for Congress, and they told me a guy like me wasn't supposed to win. Silence. No one dared to interrupt. Even Julian Marks, known for quick comebacks, was sitting stiffly now, pen motionless in hand. Byron continued, this time softer. We tell kids in struggling homes that their life depends on getting into the right school. We sell the idea that success comes from institutions, not initiative. And when they don't make it to the right campus, we act like their dreams are disqualified. He pointed gently across the desk. That's what your laugh said earlier, Julian, that a degree defines a man. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it, because the audience was already nodding, murmuring, even clapping lightly again. But let me ask you something, Byron said. When's the last time a degree taught someone courage? No answer. When's the last time a diploma showed someone how to walk through fire and come out stronger? Julian said nothing, because everyone in the room, and millions more who would soon watch the clip online, already knew. They weren't witnessing an interview anymore. They were witnessing a lesson. By now, the studio was on the edge of its seat. The air felt charged, like something historic was happening, quietly but unmistakably. Julian Marks leaned back, clearly recalibrating. The usual verbal dominance he commanded had evaporated. He had underestimated Byron Donalds, and the audience knew it. Byron didn't press the advantage with arrogance. He let the silence work for him. Then, when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower. Not because he was tired, but because he knew the weight of what he was about to say. Julian, do you know what it's like to sit across from a teenager who thinks his life is already over at 15? Julian blinked. No answer. Do you know what it's like to tell a young man that he matters when every headline, every stat, every system says he doesn't? That's where I teach. That's where I learned. Not in a seminar, not on a grant. But in the real world, where hope is a language and consistency is a miracle. The crowd didn't move. You want credentials? Byron said, turning now to the camera. How about this? He held up his hand and began counting. I'm a husband of 20 years. Credential. Father to 3 boys I've raised with discipline, faith and love. Credential. Mentor to kids who've never seen Capitol Hill but know how to survive neighborhoods that never make the news. Credential. Elected by thousands of Americans who trusted me not because I impressed a dean, but because I kept my word. Credential. There was no applause now. There was something deeper, that holy hush of people who've just been told something they can't unhear. Julian was staring, mouth slightly open, papers forgotten. Byron turned back to him with a faint, almost kind smile. You laughed at my education, Julian, but here's what you missed. He leaned forward one last time. The hardest classrooms don't have walls. The toughest degrees aren't framed. They're lived. And that was the moment Julian Marks lost the room. For once, Julian Marks had nothing to say. The man who built a career on interruptions, zingers, and verbal traps now sat frozen, not because he had been out-debated, but because he had been outclassed. Across the country, the moment began spreading in real time. Clips of Byron's words, "The hardest classrooms don't have walls," were already trending. Instagram reels, TikToks, X threads exploding with comments like, "He just shut down elitism with grace. This is what real leadership sounds like. I felt that in my soul." But inside the studio, no one was checking their phones yet. They were still sitting in the weight of Byron Donalds' presence. And then, finally, Julian cleared his throat. Well, that's certainly a powerful perspective. Byron didn't flinch. It's not a perspective, Julian, it's my life. The audience reacted to that, not with applause, but with respect. A quiet shift, a nod here, a glance there. Even the makeup artist near stage right was crying silently behind the lights. Julian tried to move forward. Let's pivot to policy. We're already talking policy, Byron said, because when you laugh at where someone comes from, you're revealing the foundation of how you govern. Julian swallowed. "I don't mean to." "You don't have to," Byron cut in gently. "It's baked into the system, but it doesn't mean we can't unbake it." He adjusted his tie, then looked past Julian into the camera again. "To every kid watching this who thinks your future depends on someone else's approval, it doesn't. To every parent who couldn't afford private school but taught their child to read with love, you did it right. And to every blue-collar worker who didn't finish college but finished every shift, you're not less qualified. You're essential." The audience rose. They weren't supposed to. Studio protocol didn't allow it. But they rose anyway, slowly, powerfully, one by one. Julian looked around, stunned. And that's when it hit him. He had invited a guest to be questioned and ended up being taught. The applause in the studio was no longer polite. It was personal. The kind that doesn't follow stage cues. It erupts when people feel like they've just been told the truth they forgot they needed. Julian Mark sat frozen behind his glossy desk, blinking in disbelief. He wasn't used to being the one without the upper hand. But now the upper hand was standing across from him, calm, grounded, and bulletproof in authenticity. And beyond the studio, America was already listening. Within an hour, Byron Donalds was trending #1 on X. The clip of him calmly stating, "The toughest degrees aren't framed, they're lived," had already been clipped and captioned across every social platform. Former teachers, veterans, nurses, plumbers, single moms, pastors, and young professionals began sharing their own versions of the moment. Didn't go Ivy. Still feeding my family. Still building my future. No degree here, but I raised 3 good humans. Credential enough. Byron just said what millions of us have felt for decades. Even some of Julian's own followers, many of them traditionally skeptical of conservative voices, began shifting. One comment under the interview feed read, "I don't usually agree with Byron Donalds, but this was real, no ego, no script, just truth." Inside the studio, as the cameras were supposed to cut to commercial, the control room hesitated. They knew. This wasn't a segment anymore. This was a cultural pulse. Julian, still trying to regain his footing, finally leaned forward and muttered, "So, what would you say to critics who say credentials matter for credibility?" Byron looked at him, not with anger, but with something deeper. Disappointment, maybe, or patience. "I'd say credentials matter when they're earned honestly, when they're not used as weapons to discredit lived experience, when they're not used to laugh people out of the room before they speak." He paused. "But if you think the only people worth listening to are the ones who passed someone else's test, you're going to miss the ones who passed life's." That was it. That was the moment the studio crew, camera ops, stage hands, even the assistant producer, began clapping too. It wasn't in the script, but it was undeniably earned. Julian Marks was quiet again, not because he had no questions left, but because the tone had shifted beyond his control. He could feel it. The audience could feel it. The nation could feel it. This wasn't a takedown. This was a teaching moment, and Byron Donalds stood in it with full awareness of what was happening. "Julian," Byron said calmly, "you invited me here to talk about education, but you really wanted to talk about status, prestige, your version of success." Julian didn't deny it. "You laughed at where I studied, because in your world, a man is only as credible as the campus he paid to walk across." The crowd shifted, murmurs of recognition, and even some quiet amends. "But I come from a world where your worth isn't measured by your resume. It's measured by what you carry. And I've carried a lot more than books. I've carried a mortgage I wasn't sure I could pay. I've carried a community through hard times. I've carried the burden of being the only black conservative in rooms full of people waiting for me to slip." The room was dead silent now. No host in sight. Just a man owning his story. And I've carried it all, while being mocked, misunderstood, and underestimated by people who confuse sophistication with substance. Then he said the line that would be quoted on the front page of 3 major newspapers by sunrise. "I didn't come from privilege, but I came with purpose, and purpose outlasts applause every time." The room exhaled. It wasn't just a mic drop. It was an emotional release. The camera cut to Julian, and for the first time in his long combative career, he looked humbled. He didn't argue. He didn't pivot. He just nodded. As if to say, "You got me." By the time the segment wrapped, the studio no longer felt like a set. It felt like a confessional. Byron Donalds hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted anyone. He hadn't even brought notes. But somehow, in under 30 minutes, he'd dismantled decades of elitist assumptions with nothing but poise, memory, and lived truth. As the cameras cut to commercial, something happened that never happened on Julian Marks' show. The crew applauded. Not a light clap, a full standing sincere ovation from behind the scenes, grips, interns, producers, even Julian's longtime director. Julian looked stunned. "Well," he muttered, "I guess that's our time." Byron smiled, stood, and offered a handshake. Julian took it. "You ever consider hosting your own show?" he asked, half joking, half defensive. "Not really," Byron replied. "I prefer conversations that don't need makeup and lights to matter." Julian didn't even flinch. He just nodded, because he knew this was bigger than him now. By the time Byron stepped out of the building, his phone was lighting up non-stop. Not from staffers or donors, but from people who had never messaged him before. Teachers, mechanics, moms, small business owners, college dropouts, GED graduates, veterans, high schoolers. The common theme? Thank you. You spoke for us. I thought I was the only one. Byron said nothing to the cameras waiting outside. He didn't have to. The internet was already on fire. Influencers from both sides of the aisle posted reactions. Podcasts scrambled to book him. Even former critics admitted something had just changed. A prominent liberal blogger wrote, "I may not agree with his politics, but Byron Donalds just gave the most honest takedown of academic elitism I've ever seen." Back inside the network, Julian Marks sat alone in his dressing room. His next guest was already waiting in the wings, but he stared at the screen, replaying the moment. That calm voice, that one sentence. "I didn't come from privilege, but I came with purpose." And for the first time in a long time, Julian wasn't sure he had the last word. It was supposed to be another political TV segment, easily clipped, lightly edited, forgotten in a few days. Instead, it became a national spark. The day after Byron Donalds' interview aired, it had already been shared by over 12 million people. Not just because it was powerful, but because it was real, in a world starving for authenticity. High schools began replaying parts of it in morning homerooms. College professors, some of them initially dismissive, posted open letters acknowledging the blind spots in their own classrooms. Even some media outlets known for aggressively criticizing Byron found themselves in a bind. Their headlines tried to soften it. Byron Donalds surprises with poise. Unexpected moment of grace from a polarizing figure. But the comment sections told the truth. No, he didn't surprise us. He reminded us. The phrase caught on. He didn't surprise us. He reminded us. Reminded us that worth isn't always tied to walls lined with degrees. Reminded us that education doesn't end in a lecture hall. Sometimes it starts at the dinner table, in the garage, or on the second job no one sees. And Byron? He didn't gloat. He didn't schedule a media tour or a book release. He just posted one message. Never let someone laugh you out of your own story. You didn't come this far to be dismissed. The post went viral instantly. Meanwhile, Julian Marks, a man who never apologized publicly in 2 decades, went on air the following night. He looked directly into the camera and for once, without his usual armor, said, Last night, something real happened on this show. I tried to reduce a man's worth to a resume, and he handed me a life story. And I learned something." Social media exploded. It wasn't just about Byron anymore. It was about everyone who had been written off, underestimated, or ignored, because their diploma didn't hang in the right frame. Byron Donalds had pulled back the curtain, and America was finally ready to listen. Weeks later, the Byron Donalds interview was still making waves, not just in newsrooms, but in neighborhoods. Teachers were starting to question how they ranked students. Employers were rethinking how they evaluated resumes. And across the country, people who had once felt invisible were standing taller. Because one man didn't defend himself with rage or credentials, he used character. At a youth center in Philadelphia, a young man stood up after watching the clip and said, "I dropped out at 16. I thought I was done. But now I know. I'm not finished, I'm just not framed." That line, "I'm just not framed," spread almost as fast as Byron's words had. It showed up on signs, on T-shirts, on murals. Because Byron had done more than silence a smug host. He had reminded the country that the measure of a man isn't what's behind his name. It's what's inside his story. When asked if he'd ever go back on Julian Marx's show, Byron simply said, "If I do, it won't be to defend myself. It'll be to defend the kids still being told their value depends on a logo at the top of a diploma." He was later invited to speak at commencement ceremonies across the country, many from schools that had once mocked men like him. At one, he closed with this: "You may have earned your degree today, but remember, the world's hardest exams don't come with answer keys. They come with setbacks, loss, failure, pressure, and still showing up anyway. So frame your diploma proudly, but don't forget the only paper that truly matters is the one you haven't written yet." Standing ovation. In that moment, Byron Donalds didn't just win an argument. He won something bigger, something that can't be measured by views or clicks. He won the respect of a forgotten nation of builders, believers, and battlers. And somewhere in a living room, in a home without a degree on the wall, a father looked at his daughter and said, "That man just told my story, without even knowing my name."